Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important discussion on putting the right trees in the right places. And thank you, first of all, to everyone who is registered. We're very pleased with the big interest in this topic. My name is Andrew Meredith. I'm Farmers Weekly editor. I've worked for Farmers Weekly for nearly 5 years now in a variety of roles, and stepped up to editor at the beginning of this year. But we all know why we're here. Trees are important. They've been essential to the progress of humanity for many reasons and in many ways down the centuries, from the building blocks of battleships to a vital source of shelter and food for ourselves, farmed animals and the other plants and species we share our farms and spaces with. Since the post-war period, though, as farms intensified and specialised, in some instances trees have got pushed to the fringes of agriculture, chopped down, hedges pushed out back in the 1970s and 1980s, and in some places, some of the time, become an afterthought as farmers followed the policy of the day, which is very output focused. Now, as environmental issues rise up the agenda and farmers gain a new appreciation of how trees can contribute not just to sequestering carbon, but also to agricultural productivity, trees are rising up the list of priorities for many farmers as they plot how to adapt their businesses for life after area payments. There's a myriad governmental tree planting targets and many sources of public and private grant funding to incentivise landowners to take part in tree planting. Established forestry land selling for record prices is also helping many people consider to take the plunge in turning pasture and other land over to trees. But turning these lofty aspirations into leafy reality is still not without its pitfalls. I'm very pleased this evening to be joined by 4 extremely knowledgeable speakers to help us navigate around some of those problems and discuss issues both of a practical nature and relating to governmental policy. I'm going to introduce them one at a time and give them the floor for some opening remarks, which will occupy in total around the first half an hour. Then the rest of the session, we're going to be switching over to a question and answer format, which will allow you to follow up on what you've heard. We've had a great number of questions submitted in advance, and you can see on your screen you've got the opportunity to keep questions coming in this evening. So without further ado, first of all, we have the Woodland Trust's Director of Woodland Outreach, John Tucker. John's worked for the Woodland Trust since 1994 in a variety of forest management roles, with a strong focus on woodland creation since 2010. His current role focuses on creation and restoration work with a wide variety of partners, from farmers and landowners, schools and communities, to local authorities and larger landowners such as defence estates. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for the introduction, and it's great to be here and great to see so much interest in this subject. So when I'm thinking about right tree, right place, there are 2 key issues for me that I think about. The first one is to be clear on your objectives. So what do you want to get out of those trees? So Laura, if we could have the slide, please. So as you can see, this is a slide from Scottish Forestry. Trees and woods can deliver a huge range of benefits. But if you're planting or wanting to create quite a quick turnaround in terms of a softwood crop for timber production, you're going to choose different species in a different location than if, for example, you wanted to create a biomass crop for biomass for heating, and you'll do different species, different location if your objective is to try and alleviate soil erosion or water quality problems, or whether you're interested in biodiversity, or for thinking about future proofing your farm in terms of shade for livestock in view of the increasing hot summers that we are forecast to get. So it's really, really clear that you're clear right from the start why you think trees are going to help you. Many trees and woods will deliver a whole range of benefits at the same time. So it might be timber production, biodiversity, and carbon. But you need to be clear right from the outset what your objectives are, why you want to do them, and if you've got multiple objectives, what the sort of the priority list is of those. So thank you, Laura. You can take the slide down now. So that's the first thing then. The second thing to think about is the site that you may want to plant those trees or regenerate that woodland on. So you've got to really understand that site in terms of things like soil quality, soil type, wetness, drainage, aspect. Is it in a frost hollow? Is it exposed? If you're thinking about creating woodlands for shelter, think about wind directions. You've got to think about, the character of the area that you're planting in. What's that woodland going to look like? Think about access. There may already be public access across the land. How are you going to maintain that? And you might want to think there's benefit from increasing that. Look around your site. What's there already. There may be really important habitats that you don't want to plant on, so chalk grassland, heathland, which already have a value in their own right. But there'll be hints around trees that are growing in hedgerows, what does well in your area. So it's gathering all this sort of information. Are there any historic monuments in the area, for example, because you need to be careful that you're going to protect them. You need to think about things like deer, rabbits, which can create havoc with new planting. Are there voles in the area or likely to come in when you've created your woodland? You've then got to think about how it all fits into your farming business. So are you going to mix those trees with livestock, for example? You're then going to have to think about how you can protect trees against livestock damage early on in their lives. So there's a whole range of things that you need to think about. Think about access in the future, how that fits into your farming business. If you're growing trees in a strip system with arable or pasture in between, have you got room for your farming equipment to use that? How are you going to prune them, collect fruit, nuts, or whatever produce you're growing? So you've got to think about all of these things. So those are the two key issues for me: objectives and then site assessment. And then you bring the two together and start thinking about your concept plans. So you think about, what species am I going to use to meet those objectives and match the site? What sort of layout am I going to use? If it's agroforestry, is it going to be a strip system? Might a hedge or a shelter belt work for me? What sort of woodland might I want? What sort of density do I plant it at? So you start to get your plans. And I would suggest right throughout this that you come to webinars like this. There are plenty of sources of advice out there. Forestry Commission, Woodland Trust ourselves, Royal Forestry Society, Farm Woodland Forum. There's some great sources of information out there. Don't be afraid to talk to people about who've been through it before. What worked for them, what didn't work for them. Seek professional advice. There's lots of it out there. I'm a chartered forester. They've got a really informative website with some great professionals on their books. So for me then, right tree, right place means thinking about objectives. It means thinking about your site, and you'll be well on your way. Give yourself plenty of time to plan. And my final caveat is, all of this goes out the window if you're not going to look after your trees. So don't think that when you've planted them, that's job done. That's only the beginning of it. You've really got to think and plan about what maintenance work needs to get them fully established. But if you do all of that, I think trees and woods can be a really valuable addition to any farm and an integral part of a future farming business. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for kicking us off there, John. Really liked the positivity. I'm sure with expertise from many people, we'll be able to navigate around all those potential issues. So secondly, this evening, we have the Chief Executive of Linking Environment and Farming, Caroline Drummond. With over 40 years experience in the farming and environment sector, Caroline has been running LEAF since it began in 1991. Her work is dedicated to securing more sustainable farming practices and positive action to address climate change, whilst building better trust and understanding of farming, food, health and the environment. Farmers Weekly was proud to award Caroline a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2019, but I'm sure she's got plenty more in the tank, as we'll hear this evening. Over to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Yes, and I hope so. Thank you. And I'm going to take a little bit more of a higher level picture, building on what Justine said. When you start looking at what are the global ambitions around tree planting, and one of the big headline areas around this is with the United Nations and the Bonn Challenge, New York Declaration on Forestry, and of course the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I don't know if you will have heard about the Bonn Challenge, but it was signed by over 100 nations, including the UK, back in 2011, with a commitment to be planting some 150 million hectares of degraded and deforested land to restore it by 2020, and then by 2030 for that to be some 350 million hectares. And when you start looking at some of the what almost became kind of top trumps in the last election with each government party, that ambition for how do we plant more trees, it's the nuances, as John's just highlighted, that are so critical here, because there is a target of planting some 30,000 hectares here in the UK each year up until at least 2025. And I think what's really important is we do actually build on this issue of restoring, reforestation, and of course new plantings. And they are fundamentally different, because there is that real opportunity to extend and build and improve on those areas that currently are, you know, a vital part of many farms here around the country. There are those opportunities for actually where we have significant challenges around pests and diseases in trees to actually start re-establishing new growth. And then, of course, there is that opportunity of just cutting off those corners, providing those habitats and building more trees on farmed land. And when you start looking at what trees offer as additional income, as well as obviously being an integral part of any business, it ranges from food, fuel, timber, fodder, forage, fiber, gum, resin, thatching, hedging, gardening, medicinal purposes, crafts, recreation, ecological services, right through to carbon capture. So trees are a really critical part, and the opportunity for making them work, it's not necessarily going to be all short term, but in the longer term is something that we really should be incredibly more mindful of, because those additional services all add to the bottom line, and they add to the benefit, not only to the environment, but the infrastructure of our land. That whole area around securing water supplies, absolutely ensuring also new jobs. And when the Bonn Challenge has been taken forward by some 5 barometer countries, which includes Brazil, El Salvador, Mexico, Rwanda, and the United States, they have achieved 98% of the implementation targets that were set and created some 334,000 jobs. So there's some real opportunity there. I'd just like to pick up a little bit on the diseases piece. When you start looking at plant diseases now, actually it is trees that are the most severely affected by not only the change in our climate, but also the rapid invasion of new diseases. And we see it with ash dieback at the moment and acute oak decline, much like we have seen it in the 70s with Dutch elm disease. And all of this creates huge challenges for making sure we are maintaining and managing and building and restoring in a productive way that actually builds the collateral for carbon sequestration. And so with that comes the next challenge around biosecurity. Xylella over in Southern Europe and across the Americas, and in particular, obviously, Xylella fastidiosa is a really contagious disease that takes no prisoners when it comes to trees. It likes all sorts of trees, but there is potential that it will come through some of the ornamentals, particularly olives, when it's going to landscape gardens through kind of white van man. And if we start having those sort of diseases coming through to the UK, again, you know, there are some very large challenges. So biosecurity is really key. And the opportunity for farmers is that nursery stock. actually, we are going to need thousands of trees moving forwards. And that community engagement, the opportunity of focusing on right tree in the right place for the right reasons is going to be absolutely critical. And I think, we at Leaf certainly always adopt an integrated approach. And that, again, is very critical in terms of looking at holistic approaches that link in landscape value and cluster opportunities going forwards through some of the things like elms, but also through opportunities for new diversifications of enhancing and driving the trees as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And how appropriate to hear a bit of barking in the background when we're talking about trees there.
Sorry, our cattle dog, we've got silage going on outside.
It's all go as it is on every good farm. Okay, thank you very much. Well, next up we have Robert Moore, who has taken some time out of his busy farming schedule as well. He farms a 323 hectare arable unit in partnership with his sister Jeanette. They've been at Bath Farm for over 30 years now. I won't say any more about the farm, as we're delighted to have a short video to show you that showcases some of their work, which we'll play now if our assistants are able to put that up, and then Robert will do his talk afterwards.
We're farming around about the 800 acre, ordinary arable farming where it's wheat, barley, oilseed rape. In 2006 the agricultural waste regulations were coming in, and we decided we'd get onto that as a diversification. So we started looking into it, and we built a plant here to process the agricultural plastic. From that we franchised it out, so we've got a network throughout the country that supply us to process. So we do tree guards, we do shotgun cartridges, we do chemical cans, fertiliser bags. Anything that the farm will produce that's plastic, we will take it in. Well, when we came here in '88, this was a highly productive arable farm where in the late 70s it had all the woods and the trees ripped out and all the hedges. So the last couple of years we've decided that we need to get hedges in, we need to get trees in, we need to get woods in to get it back to where we think it should be for a sustainable future for farming. So what we've done, we've took the very worst of the land out. We've put approximately 5 hectares of woods in, 3 kilometres of hedges in so far. We plan to put more in. There's 200 acres of grass, permanent grass gone down. We also have a stream that goes right through the centre of the farm with a track alongside it. So we decided to put the woods on the south of the track. So when any shadows come from the woods, it would be onto the track and not onto the crop over the dike. We also have a big reservoir on site, and that's utilised for the recycling side of the business as well. So we interlinked the reservoir with hedges to the new plantations of wood for wildlife tracks to go down. So we can utilise the stream, the reservoir and the woods are all interlinked, along with the permanent pasture we've put down. We've put about 200 acres of permanent grass down. We've introduced sheep, we've introduced cattle. That's the first time sheep and cattle have been on this farm for at least 60 years. So they all come into the permanent pasture, and if we have to take some of this pasture up, we will do as part of the rotation, but it'll be down for 5 or 6 years minimum anyway. Linked with all that is grass is a good carbon store. Trees are good carbon, but we put the grass down mainly for carbon as well. So we also put solar panels in to help power the plant, because I do believe, if you're recycling and then you're utilising the world's most valuable resource like fresh water and power, you're not really truly recycling. So what we're trying to do is to produce our own power, and the water, we recycle all the water, so we're not utilising good drinking water or power off the grid. We're enhancing the farm for future generations. Yes, it's going to take a fair while to do it, but the plan is to leave this farm better when we finished with it than what we received it. Not saying it wasn't right when we got it, because it was a right farm for the right time, but times have changed. so we're trying to get ahead of the curve. A neighbour, he put some trees in last year and he recommended the Moorwood scheme, said it was very easy to talk to you people. So we contacted you in the spring of last year and we found you very helpful on the knowledge of what sort of trees to put in, and the application we found was very simple and straightforward, and that's what we like, simplicity, straightforward.
If you're looking to improve your land with trees, Moorwoods could be right for you. The Woodland Trust can help you design and plant a woodland from 500 trees upwards, over half a hectare or more. We'll visit and work with you to create a bespoke scheme to help deliver what you want. From shelter belts or field corners to an amenity woodland, we can supply the right mix of trees, tree protection, and cover up to 75% of your costs. If you're interested in creating or reinstating hedgerows, then we can help with that too. More Hedges can fund up to 75% of the cost of creating hedgerows with large trees planted at regular intervals. We'll also provide planting advice and guidance to help you get started. More Woods and More Hedges are funded by Lloyds Bank. For more information and how you can get involved, head to the Woodland Trust website.
Okay, the video has stopped if we want to continue.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Like the video said, we've been farming at Bath Farm, a 356 hectare farm since 1988. When we took over the farm, it was a total arable farm, farming wheat, oilseed rape, barley and beans. In the 70s, the previous owners removed all the hedges and a 50-acre wood. This reduced the field numbers on this farm down from 70 to just 13, and in the 70s this was acceptable and the practice was widespread. We continued to farm intensively, growing wheat, winter crops, but with the ban of the burning of the stubbles, the key chemicals being removed from our armoury for the control of blackgrass, we began to lose our fight and the blackgrass began to take over. This in turn was drastically reducing our bottom line. So in 2006, we started a diversification project in the collection and processing of agricultural plastic waste. This enabled us to maintain our bottom line within our business, but the farm was still under pressure from outside our control. With running Agrocycle, we began to look at things very differently and how the farm contributes to the overall image of recycling and the environment. In 2010, we installed reed beds to clean the runoff water from the yards. In 2016, we put 72 kilowatts of solar panels in, and then a further 140 kilowatts in 2020 to help power the recycling plant. In 2019, we looked at the visual impact of our farm and how we could change this for the best environmental and bottom line. So firstly, we looked at the field records of how each field produced and performed over a period of intensive farming. With this information, which we already knew, but our hearts ruled our head, we started to transform the way we farmed. We've put in 80 hectares of rotational grass. This was for several reasons. 1, to help improve soil structure. 2, to reinstate grazing livestock under a contract basis. To create a carbon sink, and the visual and environmental impact. 65% of our farm is now down to grass and spring cropping, and this already has had a positive effect on the control of our blackgrass. We then replanted a wood of 5 hectares, and this was planted on the site of where the original wood was removed in the 70s. And to be honest, This wood should never have been removed because that has been the worst performing field we've ever had. We then looked at planting hedgerows around the grass fields and linking the reservoir to the new wood, and to date 3 kilometres of hedges have been planted. My whole aim in doing this work is to leave the farm in a better state than we took it over. And it's not saying it was bad when we did, but that happened to be the thing that was done in the 70s. But you need to recognise when things need to change, both environmentally, economically and visually. The environment cannot afford to wait for a positive change. We have to make that happen. By that I mean I will not wait to see what payments I will get from the government. Whatever colour, I need to get on with it and do the job now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Really interesting video and presentation there, and I'm sure we'll hear more details shortly of how you went about that on your farm. But finally, we're delighted to have Phil Jarvis with us, who's Head of Farming, Training and Partnerships at the Allerton Project. Phil has been involved in all farm-based research and demonstration at the farm at Loddington in Leicestershire since 1992. He's combined his practical farming activities with education and training, specialising in soil, cover crops and regenerative farming systems. Over to you, Phil.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. I wanted to talk about a mixed landscape, because on the farm here over the last 30 years, we've got a mixture of new woods, mature woods, replanted woods, hedges of different stage, of different management practices. And they all go in to tell the story. And I think John's comments were made very well earlier on about having a plan, and management and maintenance is key. But I want to talk, just focus it down a little bit to another thing that John mentioned about agroforestry. So, you know, we might find that, for example, you know, there's alley cropping, there's fruit, there's nuts, there's shelter for livestock, maybe a sporting interest, and there may be well-being as well. And I think, as I see my Leicester Longwolves grazing in there, sometimes they do test my well-being. But having said that, they can give your, you know, they can give another aspect to life and getting a work-life balance right. And different audiences come to the countryside for different things. But we shouldn't think just purely about carbon and biodiversity. We shouldn't be afraid to talk about the commercial aspects of woodlands as well. And the incentive to look after them and maintain them is really important. But just to turn to the right tree in the right place, obviously there are some habitats that sometimes are quite poor. They might be heathland. They might say, well, Robert illustrated, you know, an poor woodland seems a good idea to go back into a woodland. However, sometimes heathland has different biodiversity, you know, reptiles, snakes, etc. And planting of trees over it can actually alter a landscape completely and change the dynamics. So, you know, we have to think carefully about that. And I just want to talk, you know, a couple of things about joined up thinking as well, and building back greener, because there's a carbon footprint of planting trees around wooden stakes, perhaps plastic cable ties, plastic tree guards. And I think, you know, building back greener and joined up thinking, it would be great if the government gave some incentives, perhaps for us to promote renewable tree guards. Perhaps even my Leicester Longwoods would really appreciate them being made out of wool, for example. And I think, to pick up on another one of Robert's comments, is that if you're going to make tree guards, make them out of something that we either is purely biodegradable, not something that's a hybrid that can't go into a waste stream and be processed. That's really important. So I think from that point of view, we've got to think carefully. If we're going to plant 25 million to 75 million trees or huge hectarage each year, we need to think of the carbon footprint of the plastic that we might be putting around them. And so we need to think as well about the wider benefits to pollinators, to farmland birds, to water, to livestock, soil erosion especially. You know, trees can be, can help with that. And they can produce wildlife corridors, you know, hedgerow trees as well, and well-maintained hedgerows can help us provide those corridors, but also build up that network of not taking too much land out of production, but enhancing our hedgerows that are already there to capture this carbon dioxide and turn it into carbon. So really, I'll probably leave my, because I think we're just about right on time. So if I leave my comments there, and I look forward to the questions.
Right on time with a panel of speakers. Wonders will never cease. Thank you very much, Phil. Really appreciate that intro. And let's just pick straight back up on those tree guards then, because you're absolutely right. Everyone's seen the plastic tree guards that are the basis of so many new plantations. And if you multiply that across the government's enormous tree planting targets, that's a huge amount of plastic. So have you got any advice for people when they're considering whether to go with plastic or something renewable? And what about the pros and cons of each?
Well, and you're right to pick up on the pros and cons. You know, plastic tree guards are very durable. You know, they can protect trees for 10, 20 years. The difficulty as well is there's the maintenance and taking them off and then disposing of them responsibly, and not make the landscape, covering the landscape in plastic, which we don't take away, has some detrimental effects, which we don't always think of when we first come to it. You know, renewable tree guards, biodegradable ones, if they biodegrade too quickly, they don't protect your tree. All tree guards, and John mentioned about voles, our experience is, whilst my sheep might nibble the top of them, the voles and the moles perhaps can have some damage to trees as well. So there's a whole host of things to consider. But I think if we're going to talk regenerative, we're going to talk renewable, if we're going to talk proactive, and we already know that, a lot of our renewable resources, what we've built a lot of our countryside on centuries ago around wool, is now being disposed of. It's not worth anything. It seems a shame that we don't try and combine this to help us find a real solution for a problem around trees.
Robert, you've made a business out of the recycling plastic and other things as well, so you can see this from both sides. Have you used only plastic guards when you were planting your trees?
Yes, we used Corex, and we've used PVC spirals. But when we take all these tree guards in from a lot of our customers, and we do handle thousands of them, we specifically say they must be separated. The Corex, which is the green tubes, they must be in one bag, and the PVC, which is the spirals, they actually degrade over time with the light, and we actually, the market for those is very, very, very limited and very specialist. So we actually landfill those. But the Corex ones and the HD ones, as long as they're separated, can be recycled quite easy.
Okay, well, a good early tip there on the pros and cons, but let's perhaps, just to properly kick off this Q&A, zoom right back out. And Caroline, I'm going to come to you for this. There seems to be, as you alluded to, an awful lot of political chatter around trees, and the different political parties trying to outdo each other with targets and proposed targets. And you mentioned global, but let's stick to the UK for now. There's different targets and different objectives even within the 4 nations. Do farmers have enough information at their disposal to know really what the government wants them to do, or is it still too much hot air and not enough detail?
I think in terms of the overall ambition, it's certainly a stated ambition. The implementation of that, however, on an individual farm level is not clear yet. And the opportunity, therefore, to support, whether it be through ELMS or woodland grant schemes, is still vague. But from that point of view, I think, as Robert really highlighted, don't wait around, see what happens from a government perspective, because actually, one, we've got 10 years to make sure that we are really driving this opportunity for sequestering carbon, for really building environmental and landscape aspects. And, there has been some level of reassurance from governments that, there will be support for work that has been done. It's not just about wait and then do it. So I think, we need to keep on ensuring that we push and hold governments to task in that area. But also, there are those other commercial opportunities. And, I alluded to some of these ones, particularly around the nursery stock, which is going to be so key. We do not have sufficient homegrown nursery stock. And actually, the opportunity, whether that be through a local community group, a local school, and saying, let's do an autumn collection of seeds and start growing them up and creating a community aspect and a community woodland, right through to actually a more commercial venture of really driving hardcore good stock, really good stock, is actually something that people should start considering, because we do need more trees. And we do need to make sure that what we do plant is not only effectively good stock, but then continues to be managed well. And I think, as John really highlighted, and Phil certainly did as well, this is not just about planting a tree and then saying good luck to you. It is really about the management of making sure that it fits within your farming system, is there for the right reasons, whether it be for shelter or whether it be for actually, other benefits within the farming system, which could be landscape and wildlife corridors, etc.
Okay, fair point. John, let's come to you then. Caroline's absolutely right. Obviously, there's many reasons to get stuck into tree planting if we go about it in the right way, of course, and to do it straight away. I think there's a famous saying, isn't there? The best time to plant a tree was yesterday. Might be remiss remembering that. But, you talk to a lot of farmers about this on a day-to-day basis. Is there anything in particular that's holding people back at the moment, and anything relating to that you feel they should know that might encourage them to start sooner rather than later?
So I think there are several things, Andrew. I think for many farmers, tree planting is not something that they do every day, or they don't have much experience of. They want to get it right. So I think there is a real need for really good, easily accessible advice to get people started. I've been really impressed with some of the videos that are out now on the Forestry Commission website, Farm Woodland Forum, and when people can now start to get back out on site again, I'd really urge people to talk to people who've been through this before. So I think advice is really important to get you through those planning stages, first of all. We've got some really good advisors within the Woodland Trust that can help people do that. So that's the first thing. I think it's certainly from an English perspective, the New England Woodland Creation Offer looks financially really attractive. And it's got some very interesting add-ons that can, bring additional income streams in for water benefits, for nature benefits, and for people benefits. So people can really, I think it's a really good opportunity. We've then got the carbon market as well. And it's great that, in England, there's a forest carbon guarantee, which can offer farmers long-term reassurance about income streams up till 2050. So I think we're beginning to get, the starting blocks, the building blocks there. But going through those grant processes, looking at the carbon code, even as a professional, I find it really challenging. And this is my day-to-day work. So somebody coming into it who's new to it, they can find it a really daunting process. So I go back, it's advice about the planning, it's advice about the grant systems, and that's got to be really freely available to the farming sector. I think that would make a huge difference.
Okay, let's go straight on to some questions from the audience then. Here's one from Ed that was submitted before the webinar started this evening. That just picks up nicely on what you're saying there about not delaying. Ed's asking, will farmers be able to claim carbon credits for trees, planted in the duration of these schemes? If you plant a tree now, it's not going to be ineligible for any future scheme that comes along that's better, is it?
I'll jump in and try and answer that, Andrew. I think they can claim the carbon credits from that, but they'll need to register their planting under the carbon code, which is run by the Forestry Commission. Again, go to the Forestry Commission website. There's good details there. You need to register. You need to now register your planting before you do it. So you can't retrospectively try to claim the carbon. But I think, it is worthwhile registering it under the carbon code, getting it verified, and then you've got the opportunity to market that carbon. And I think, you know, there's been a huge amount of increase in interest from corporates of all shapes and sizes about wanting to purchase carbon. So I think there are some really good opportunities. Yes, the carbon price, I hope, will go up in the future, but I think now is a really good time to start.
Brilliant. Phil, you do a lot of forward-looking stuff there at the Allerton project. Do you think that farmers are going to get rich in the future or by offsetting the pollution from these big industries like the airline industry? Is that something that you see as a big strand of income in the future potentially? You might be on mute, Phil, unless I've absolutely stumped you there.
No, you've done me well. I wasn't. So yes, I think probably not a big, huge income, but I think certainly an opportunity to be a supplementary income. I think what we're going to find is that there are going to be lots of opportunities and lots of schemes, whether it be through local authorities or John's mentioned the Forestry Commission, lots of private businesses, and I think if I turn it back to government as well, we really need to see where woodland sits, whether blended finance in going forward means that government and businesses can help with farmers to sort of share some of that load. So I think there's a lot of carbon capture projects. In the last 12 months, certainly 7 or 8 have approached us here about taking forward tree planting and capturing carbon in the soil. So I think there is a potential. Pick up one of the points that Robert said as well is, sometimes the landscape value and the well-being value, actually planting it for landscape, it is an overriding factor. It seems the right thing to do. So I think it should definitely be one of the things that we look at as potentially some income stream, but it shouldn't be just the only driver.
Dare I say, you keep those Leicester longwalls for their lifestyle value rather than their income stream. Maybe it's the case with some trees as well then. Perhaps that's the mindset that farmers need. It's
surprising how many doors, forestry and livestock open though. So there are different ways of approaching situations.
Caroline, let's move straight on to the next question. We've got one here from Graham Evans. Graham, I think you're on the call this evening. Thank you for submitting your question. Graham says, in 2010, we planted several areas on our holding with a variety of different trees under the Better Woodlands for Wales scheme, all local provenance stock, including Cecil oak, rowan, birch, hazel, hawthorn, and dare I say it, predominantly ash. And along comes ash dieback. You mentioned some other diseases, obviously, as well, that are a threat out there. What is your advice for replanting? Perhaps we can go round the room, but let's start with you, Caroline. What would you say Graham should do potentially there?
Well, I mean, I guess it's managing and taking out what you've got, and I think this is, the practicality of taking a diseased ash out is in itself often it can be quite dangerous because the ash dieback hollows out the center of the trunk, and often when you take a chainsaw that it can splinter and go several ways. So it's the professionalism, and I guess as a 10-year-old tree they're not huge. But it's the importance of taking out diseased trees. And it's interesting, certainly around here, we're in Cornwall, there are thousands of trees that are dying because of ash dieback, and they will fall if they are not managed and taken out. So I guess it's then scheduling the appropriate replanting around that. And, John will have, as a chartered forester, will have a huge superiority in terms of knowledge in that particular area. But I think, as with anything, it's all about effective management. And it sounds like, the questioner has come up with a really, has taken things very solid in terms of making sure that there is a diversity in the selection in the first place, which in itself builds resilience. And, when we've got a climate that is changing so very rapidly and we don't know what that looks like going forwards, actually being able to have that diversity of different tree planting is not only important for ensuring resilience actually within the woodlands, but it's also ensuring actually the sort of the disease capability, the disease management capability is also good.
Yes, John, Graham actually asked, for general advice on replanting and what, if any, funding may be available. Is there any particular grants he's going to not be able to have access to now that he's already planted once under grant funding? Is that going to be an issue?
Yeah, I in a Welsh context, I honestly don't know the answer to that, Andrew, in terms of finance available to replace and restock. That would have to be a question for his Natural Resources Wales office. Although if I can look up and get back to him if I've got his contact details. Just to pick up on the sort of what to do and what species question. I go back to what I said right at the start in my little introduction. It really depends on what his objectives are. So if he's got an objective just about wildlife and landscape, he actually might think about doing nothing. If the ash trees are dead but they're safe, that's a good habitat. So if there's good natural regeneration, there may be trees coming up already. But if he's got a timber objective, for example, then he might think, yes, it's time to get the ash out. And I can, he might want to put in things like wild cherry, hornbeam, wild service, field maple, even things like sweet chestnut, a non-native but a fabulous tree in terms of timber production. So, ducked the first bit of the question about the grants. Apologies for that, but I'll follow that up. But in terms of, think about what you want long-term out of those trees, and that will guide your species choice.
Brilliant. It's frustrating in a way, but completely understandable. These things are so varied, depending on which side of which border you're on. As always, seek local advice, I guess, is the first port of call. Robert, we'll come back to you with a question from William Mackiness, and forgive me, William, if I've mispronounced your surname there, but thank you for your question. Robert Williams asking, will trees block land drains? I'm reluctant to plant along river courses. Was that a factor when you were considering where to put your trees?
Yes, it absolutely was. We've got the land drain map, and where we've planted ours, there is a separate drainage scheme at the bottom of that field that doesn't interfere with the rest of the field. So when that particular field was drained, it was drained in several schemes. So the trees are over one scheme and they're not over the other scheme. So yes, it will affect where the trees are, but no, it won't affect the rest of the field. We were very, very conscious of that when we chose where to put the trees when we planted them.
Important point there then. So do take care, and hopefully you've got some good maps of your drains, William. Although I did enjoy watching Jeremy Clarkson out with his divining rods, if you've been watching Clarkson's farm over the last few days. So perhaps you can have a go with a few bits of metal if you've lost them, but no guarantees it will work, of course. Let's crack on straight with the next question then. We had an interesting question from Laura, who wrote in before the webinar, and she asked, is there any information on tree species that are most beneficial for silver pasture and good for poultry diets? Does anyone want to jump in there and tackle that one?
I don't mind trying to kick that one off. It's a really interesting area, actually. So things, I have a list in front of me, things that are regarded as sort of safe and good for sort of cattle. So willow is really good. So it's the root, it provides salicylic acid, which is the root of aspirin. So we have farmers that are growing willow for medicinal and nutritional purposes. Willow's a good source of cobalt, actually. So when lambs are just coming off weaning, there's a lack of cobalt in the grass. So things like willow fodder can actually be really good for them. There's, things like elm. You'll see cattle grazing, really enjoying elm fodder. That's another good one. Things to avoid, there are species, oak because of the acorns, beech, wild cherry, spindle can be a problem, and yew. So there is a fabulous website, and I couldn't put my hands on it before the meeting. It's organised by some zookeepers who feed all sorts of trees to their animals. They've got about 10 years of records of what's worked and what hasn't. And again, I'll try and find that website. It's really worth the look.
Andrew, could I just come in there a little bit and pick up on that subject that John was just alluding to? We're doing some work on willow feeding to lambs at the Allerton project here in conjunction with Sutton Bonington and Nottingham University, and looking at the nutritional benefits and also looking at whether you can affect the output at the other end as well, and whether you can alter that. So it's in its only just in its second season now, but that's got some interesting stuff coming through. I'd also say about diversity and picking, animals, not wishing to return to my Leicester Longwolves, but animals do tend to graze. They love a variety. So a variety of leaves and different trees is really good for their nutrition and for their health as well, and a variety of diet. And I think I'd just pick up on the thing about shelter as well at this point. In the fact, often a lot of us think of this as an animal welfare issue. But in some areas, when you're offering shelter, you're offering the ability to not use energy to keep yourself cool or using energy to keep yourself warm. So from an animal's point of view, it's quite good for growth rates as well. And sometimes in very exposed sites, trees are a good thing. And if you're adding to the nutritional benefit, then there's another benefit of planting some woodland or hedges.
Can I just add to Andrew? I mean, I know Innovative Farmers, which we're engaged with, have also done quite a lot of work on this area of some of the medicinal opportunities of trees and where cattle in particular are grazing trees. And I used to lecture at Shuttleworth College, Agricultural College, back in the sort of late 80s, and we established some agroforestry back then, and it was cherries. It was early days, and I think both the productivity of the sheep and the productivity of the trees neither really kind of got the right balance. But I think, a lot of this is still going to be very experimental, and a lot of it will bring knowledge from other countries as well on several levels. And just as Phil was saying about this importance of shelter, it's not just shelter from cold and rain and wind, it's also shelter from increasingly hot weather. And I know, when every year we always get from sort of various dairy magazines, etc., watch out for cancers and sunburn on your cattle, particularly those that are, more the whiter ones. And I think, this is something that farmers are really mindful that we have a changing climate. And actually, there are benefits, hidden benefits that we've often not really accounted for.
Good points. Oh, thank you very much. There's a broader point here, I suppose, in what you touched on there, particularly Caroline. You perhaps first heard of agroforestry in the 80s. I certainly hadn't heard of it until a few years ago. And if I'm not speaking out of turn, I think perhaps many people on this call will still instinctively think of trees in particular, as well as hedgerows, of course. These bigger plants on our farms has been very much on the edges of the fields, and the fields still been, where the business of farming happens. But I don't know, do you just want to pick back up on the idea of agroforestry in general? And if you're grazing into your crystal ball, do you think we'll see trees crisscrossing fields through the middle as well as around the edges more in the years to come? What other benefits are there of there? We can take some comments again around the room on that topic.
If I just kick up on that, yes, I mean, without a doubt, we're certainly seeing interest. We're just putting some case studies towards the Bond Challenge of what farmers are doing and have done. And I think, there are a lot of opportunities. And in fact, we had a meeting earlier today when one of our farmers was talking about how he's introducing agroforestry into his arable situation. And a lot of sort of nervousness from others around the table as to whether that was something they would pick up. And I think, it's got to work first and foremost. And when farmers see it working, for somebody, then that's what sort of drives, that is what develops it. And if I look around our farmer members where trees are really valuable, there are those trees that are allowing, the odd tree to grow up in a managed hedgerow, right through to the use of trees for shelter belts to avoid soil erosion, to support crops in the field, whether they be soft fruit or polytunnels, to act as a barrier from on a view perspective. So I think, the broader element of in-field trees, and aside from the challenges around sort of wrapping a piece of equipment around it, is always something that actually has a huge opportunity.
I think if I may say something on that, with the way the subsidies and all that are declining, if the government, whichever colour it is, or the way that the environment wants to grow, puts carbon credits on your trees, and you could trade those, I think more trees would come onto the farm, like pockets or hedgerows, small spinneys, and that would encourage the farmer to grow them and discourage him to remove them. It's just maybe a thought for political thought further down the field as our subsidies are getting diminished.
And Andrew, there's some good resources. I mean, Dr. Paul Burgess has written the Agroforestry Handbook, and I would signpost that. That's it's almost like the first really thorough, and there are many more now. And the agroecology website is a good source of information for that. So that if you want to know more about agroforestry. And it's also fair to say that governments now have a position on agroforestry. They've set out their stall a little bit, and we'll see some things in sustainable farming incentive that touch on woodland. It'll only be part of the problem, but there's some good information around at the moment, and lots of farmers are already doing it. I can think of several who have been quite active on social media, showing their fruits of their labour in the winter months.
Yeah, sorry, Andrew, if I can just
sure
add in. It's really interesting, your comment that you hadn't heard about it until very recently, but it's a very ancient sort of farming system. We've just sort of lost sight of it, really. So, I was looking at some fantastic pictures of some old wood pastures in Scotland based around, ancient crabapple or Scottish wild apple. You think about Epping Forest in London, that was in effect a wood pasture system with animals grazing through under hornbeam pollards. So, it's not new. We've just forgotten about it. And I think it's got, it offers fabulous opportunities. It's not about planting trees everywhere on your farm. It's about how you can put trees in the right place to integrate and support your farming business. So I'm really excited by the prospects of what it holds.
Let's take another question from the chat then. Freya Morgan, thank you for your question. But they're absolutely flying in, by the way. I really appreciate all of these, and I do apologise. It's already clear we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but please do keep them coming in. Freya asks, if you wish to plant trees in an existing hedgerow, how do you go about making sure it survives, as the hedge will be taking all the water and light? Let's go to you perhaps first, Robert. You've been doing some of that there on your farm, haven't you? What did you do to avoid those trees not getting a good start?
We've not put any trees in any existing hedges because we didn't have any. We've put trees in the new planted hedges. So when it was a drought a couple of months ago, we went down and we watered the trees with IBCs to keep some water going. Hopefully that's worked. But if you ask me how we would plant trees if we did a wood in the future, on the video, our trees are all in waves. They're not in straight lines. And that's done for visual impact more than anything else. But if I was doing it again, I would put the waves in, but I would put straight lines down so we could irrigate them. Because that early part is a key factor to making sure they get water. Now, whether we manage to get water to all our trees, I don't know. But in the answer to your question, we've never put a tree in a hedgerow because we didn't have them to start with. So everything was new planted.
Let's come to you then, John. Have you offered advice on this topic? You have to hack the hedge back a fair bit, or is there a way to do it more sympathetically?
You can, hedge laying, for example, is a traditional practice. So if you can give your new tree as much light and room as possible by doing some laying of some shape or form, that will certainly help. And I think Robert's alluded to one of the key issues is, if you need to be able to mark and identify that tree so you don't forget about it, that you can get back and water it in its early stages. And if when you plant it, you can put some form of mulch around it, so wood chip mulch is really effective. That will help retain moisture in the soil and help the tree through those first vulnerable couple of years.
Phil, you touched on pests as well, as opposed to disease, I think, in your opening remarks a little bit. We got a question from Alison Alexander here. Thanks for joining us, Alison, from Manchester Metropolitan University. And she's asking, what is the latest best practice on grey squirrel control? Her friend just lost several acres of 20-year-old oak woodland due to squirrel damage. Have you got any thoughts on keeping back those tree rats?
Probably not my area of expertise, squirrels, but what I would say is this is really why some of the planting rates are at high. You can probably afford to lose a few if you would, and also planting more diversity as well. So getting something that perhaps the squirrels don't like. But I think certainly from an aspect of whether it be water shortage or it be a whole host of conditions on disease, perhaps a variety of trees is the best thing there on that point of view. I wouldn't offer to be an expert on grey squirrels, so I probably couldn't answer that one. Okay,
but is there a broader point here, Caroline? These are habitats which the trees are sharing with a host of other plants and animals. We're going to have to factor in some losses regardless, aren't we? I know several acres of loss is far less than ideal, but how would you sort of calibrate people's expectations, perhaps, who are just setting out with planting new woodland?
Well, I guess, that's why holistic approaches are absolutely critical. It's knowing, who you've got there, what you've got there in terms of the priority species. And actually, woodland is very good for a whole new host of biodiversity as well. So I think it is, as Phil has just said, the importance of making sure, you're not going to get 100% take. But actually, this is about, really trying to develop and promote land sharing, in effect, particularly in those areas where you've got woodland. If I look around the copses that we've got here, the small amount of woodland area, and indeed the hedge infrastructure, it is home to an absolute wealth of biodiversity. And I think, that with it, as Phil said, it's good for your mental health and well-being, but actually it's also good for ensuring that building the resilience within the farming system as well. And we mustn't forget that, although you mentioned earlier, sort of like, farming's in the field and then the biodiversity is out on the outside. Actually, biodiversity is at all levels and at all depths, actually, as well. And so getting that variety and diversity is a critical part of actually managing the business. And I think, one of the important things that John has said, this critical area of making sure it is the right thing for the right area, because not everywhere is going to have trees planted on it. And actually planting trees in some areas would be devastating. So it's again, has to be so site specific.
And Caroline, John mentioned also right at the beginning, saying, have a look around and see what's doing well. So if if you want to see what's doing well and perhaps has beaten the battle with the grey squirrel, have a look at what may have done well around you.
Final thoughts on that question, John?
Yeah, gosh. I would say, I always think, particularly if I'm doing woodland creation for biodiversity and wildlife, for example, that if you're planting trees, you're just starting the process. You're just putting the first lick of paint on the canvas. Nature can add loads to that. So, you might think about putting more fruiting species in. That will bring birds in. They'll start to bring in other tree species as well. So, you need to think about that as well. Need to think about not being scared of using natural regeneration, direct seeding. You can get much greater densities of species there, much more species choice, and that will give you a much bigger selection for the future.
Okay, let's go to our next question. We've got from Liam Cuppet. I think I've pronounced that correctly, but again, apologies if not. Liam says, we are currently in our first year of producing bare root trees for forestry and are planning to expand our growing area. Which species do you think will be in demand in coming years? Who'd like to offer a view on that?
I'm happy to kick off, Andrew. I'm really pleased to see that DEFRA Forestry Commission are really they have realised that, as Caroline alluded to, we have a massive demand for trees ahead of us in the future, and we haven't got the supply. So they're doing a piece of work at the moment, looking at what the forecasts are likely to be for the future. They're trying to get a much better notification system in process, which I think is beginning to take place in Scotland, so that growers know what people might want in terms of demand over the next 4 or 5 years and can start growing it. So they're starting to do that in England. They're looking in England at the moment about what seed sourcing we've used from what are called registered woodlands, where you go and collect seedlings for sale, what's been accessed over the last 5 years. And we're looking at trying to work out strategies for what seed supply we will need in the future. So there is work going on. I would particularly point the person who answered that question to look at that nursery notification scheme. I think that's going to be a really valuable tool for nurseries to plan for the future.
Anyone else with thoughts on future trees to add to that, or shall we move on?
I mean, I'd just add about multifunctionality. So, for example, not just trees, but things like hazel. If you're in a traditional hedge laying area, planting your own stakes and binders is not a bad thing to do. We talked about sweet chestnut and its value in things like charcoal and fencing, traditional crafts. I think always the oak and some of those things that we might use, for example, but you've got to look after them. If you want timber to be used in the building industry in the future, you have to maintain it and get a straight tree for 30, 40, 50 years time. And I would just add, fruit and nuts seem to be particularly popular at the moment. So there may be an opportunity for a lot of people. And my final tree would be, there are quite a few people exploring things like resistance, although I'm not sure it's true resistance, elm trees and ash. And if we can get some of them back into the landscape from that sort of stock, that would be a good start.
Just to add, I think this fruit area is incredibly interesting and incredibly important, with huge potential. We have a national food strategy, which is really going to be looking at driving different diets and more sustainable diets. And our capability in this country is limited in fruit. We have an edible hedge. We've yet to eat anything off it ourselves because the biodiversity loves it, but somebody's enjoying it. But I think, the real opportunity, and certainly, some of our members, that is what they're seriously looking at, the opportunity of well, in fact, Phil, you've got a community woodland that you've planted with apples locally with your local people as well, haven't you?
Yeah. So, that's basically traditional Leicestershire and the surrounding counties, and the community planted it. The community often harvest it as well. We've sent some into a local cider company. It isn't a huge enterprise at the moment, but it might become as the trees get more mature. So there's opportunities there, and actually that local provenance and your local food into your local community, whilst we've given up some of that from perhaps our traditional orchards around parts of the country, I see there's a willingness after the sort of pandemic we've been through for a bit of resurgence in that. So I'd encourage looking at that.
And I think, it's not just the food that comes out of that, it's the actual community engagement that brings together that that positioning of a farm within a local community, which is often kind of, the value of that is often neglected. So it is such an exciting opportunity.
I certainly appreciate some woodland walks on the weekend, seeing as I'm mostly based here in southeast London, although hailing from the hills in mid Wales. I should hastily add, I don't want anyone to think that I was born in the southeast of England. That would be dreadful. But John, David Thorne is asking, please can someone demonstrate the maths behind the planting? It's all very loose. He'd like to see an example cost in revenue so he could be able to calculate the internal rate of return on long-term investment for his estate. I'm assuming he's referring there to sort of quite commercial timber, and we haven't got time this evening to break out the Excel spreadsheets. But where could he go to talk to someone about that, for example?
Well, I mentioned earlier the Institute of Chartered Foresters. If you go on their website, there's a list of consultants there, many of whom will specialise in commercial timber production. So that's the place to start there, and they'll give you your advice. That sounds like he's planning, thinking it really well, and that's a really good start. But also, let's not just think about the timber potential, which is obviously really important, but I would urge people to think a bit more widely about other income streams that are coming in. We've talked about carbon, we've talked about water. There's some really interesting possibilities there. Air quality, trees are really good at, so ammonia can be an issue. I know government are really keen to drive those numbers down in terms of ammonia production and methane as well. So I think there will be a broad range of income streams available on top of timber.
Okay, I'm going to try and step up the pace of questions a bit just to try and get through a few more of these. So short answers, hopefully, from now on, please, folks, and maybe only one answer per question. You touched on methane there, John. I'm going to come back to you with a very quick question from David Brass. He says, we've not had a single mention of ammonia so far, which is another issue. Would anyone like to comment on the potential of trees to help farmers comply with the aims of the Clean Air Act by absorbing ammonia? I know that's a big topic, but...
Yes, trees are very good at absorbing particulate matter, gases such as ammonia, so they can do it really well around the source of that. So it might be, I recognise David's name, poultry units, egg farms, for example, they can be really useful. So mix of species, you can include some conifer as well to help when the broadleaves haven't got leaves in the winter. But yeah, they've got a big role to play. But again, right tree, right place, think about location and species.
Fabulous. We've got a question here from Neil Franklin. He says he's a fruit grower. Could someone explain the difference between a hedgerow and a windbreak? I appreciate the difference in terms of multi-species versus single species, but is there a specific height or width difference on each? Who would like to pick up on that one? Is there a terminology, or is it just a bit not quite so specific as that?
Gosh, I always think of a hedgerow as, if I'm creating a hedgerow, it'll be 2 rows of trees, for example, 5 or 6 trees per metre. If I'm doing a windbreak, I'd probably want 5 rows of trees, probably a minimum width 4 metres. So that's my difference. But do I care what the difference is? Not really, as long as somebody's putting some trees in the ground.
And my short answer is all my hedgerows are windbreaks, Andrew.
It's a fair point. Caroline, Erica Bauer has joined us, and she says, is there any scope or support for natural woodland regeneration? I assume that's what she means, where trees aren't planted, but they are just growing naturally from the spreading of seed. Do you know anything about support for that, or if that's perhaps a preferable option in some circumstances, rather than farmers getting their spades out and planning these things?
Well, I again, it's traditionally been done in some areas. I would think, a lot of our copses are natural regeneration, and certainly I can remember one of our very first demonstration farmers in West Sussex, on where the cattle used to be droved across the country, had the county there, had very managed land for crops, then a little bit of managed for woodlands, and then a kind of what is now termed as rewilding in effect. And it's very likely that some level of support through the ELMS is going to come from around rewilding, which is in effect what they're saying here.
Yeah, Andrew, there is support under the new England Woodland Creation Offer. So if you're in England, natural regeneration is now included in that. So there is a level of support for that.
Now we've got a question here from Dominique Bacon, and it goes as follows. Does anyone have to cull deer to save their trees from damage? We've seen a huge increase in deer more recently. Are there any grants to cull deer? This is perhaps expensive and possibly unacceptable to the general public, she says. Are there any issues around it? Does anyone have any deer issues in their area, or know any landowners that are having to take action there?
Yeah, I don't mind starting that off.
Please.
I'm old enough to remember creating a woodland in Kent, East Kent, 25 years ago, where there were no deer at all. I think there are very few places now around the UK where deer browsing is not a potential problem. So that's part of your assessment. But talk to the Deer Initiative, talk to people who are professionals in the deer world, get an assessment of what the issue are, species numbers. You may need to do some culling, but you need to do it across the landscape. It's no use just doing it on your own land. You need to work with your neighbours, otherwise you're just creating a vacuum and they move in. It's not about exterminating everything. It's great to see them, but you need to have them at a level where trees and the deer can survive.
Lovely. Okay. Just looking through the questions here again. We've got a question from Andrew that was submitted beforehand, and he asked, would willow be a suitable tree for a rapid growing, easy to establish windbreak, or does it have major drawbacks? I suppose that very much depends on site, but John, do you want to tackle that one again, first of all?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, I think willow could be one species that you could use as part of a windbreak. But I think we've said it before, you need diversity, move away from just planting single species. Willow's quick growing, could dominate the site, but because it's quick growing, it can be quite fragile. So I'd mix in some lower growing shrubs, hazel, blackthorn, hawthorn, wild cherry, oak, alder, as well as some willow, but don't rely on willow just alone.
It does establish itself really quickly. The trouble is if you leave it after about 15 years and you're not going to maintain your hedge at all, it can become quite ungainly and unsightly. I think there is an opportunity there, perhaps for heating in it. You can chip it and burn it, and then I'm not sure too much about the regrowth, but I know it's really easy to establish.
Final question of all this evening, then we are going to have to wrap things up, but very quickly, Robert, one for you. We've touched on the maintenance of woodland a few times after planting being so important. What are your tips for people who are going to plant trees? What should they be doing in those first few years? You said about watering through dry spells. Is there anything else in particular? Oh, I'm afraid you're on mute. If we can't get Robert to unmute, perhaps we'll come quickly to you, John, for that one as time is tight. Sorry, Robert.
Yeah, just make sure you think about what the requirements are right at the start. Have a plan of action written down. So it may be things like watering, it may be pruning, taking guards off, all of those sorts of things. But you need to factor that in right at the start.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, everyone, we do have heaps more questions here, but we are running out of time, so I am going to have to wrap things up for this evening. It's an incredibly broad topic, and I know, of course, that we were never going to cover it all in great detail, but hopefully we've done enough to whet your appetite on a number of topics, and hopefully at least signpost you to where you should be going for more information if you're considering getting going with tree planting in any shape or form. Our panel will have a copy of all the questions that we didn't have a chance to answer this evening. I know they'll be able to respond to you directly after this on those finer points if they have a chance. So I think, you know, to summarise, we've been left with a lot to think about. There are many pitfalls, but the take-home message is clearly there are so many positives about putting in more trees and hedgerows if it's done correctly. We had a huge list of benefits that they can offer, you know, right from wind shelter to sources of food and timber, and the importance of them for the community as well. If you're in a position to be able to share those woodlands that you plant with people from further afield, there's so many who are enjoying them now in the last year for recreation during all the COVID madness. So I wish you all the best with your endeavours going forward, whatever stage of the journey you're at. And for now, all that remains is for me to thank our 4 panellists, John Tucker, Caroline Drummond, Robert Moore and Phil Jarvis, as well as the support team here at Farmers Weekly of Laura and Ruth, who've been so instrumental to tonight running smoothly. Thank you also to our partners, Lloyds Bank and the Woodland Trust. And finally, thank you to all of you for attending. Have a pleasant evening, and we hope to see you again at another Farmers Weekly webinar very soon. Thank you all very much indeed.